Hello, Kimaren Riamit. Thank you very much for joining us. You're from Kenya and representing Indigenous people within these negotiations. Could you tell me a little bit about Indigenous people in Kenya?
Thank you very much. Yes, I come from Kenya. Personally, I'm Indigenous. I come from the Maasai pastoral Indigenous community in Kenya. There are several groups in Kenya that have been identified under the UN as Indigenous peoples in Kenya. Not Indigenous because they were there before the rest of Kenyans, but Indigenous because of the marginalization over time from the colonial times and subsequent independence government. Broadly speaking, categorized under their livelihoods practices, they are mostly pastoralists and hunter-gatherers communities. One of them, as I said, is a Maasai community from which I come from.
And what are the impacts of climate change on your people?
The impact, Indigenous people generally rely on nature-based resources. Pastoralists rely on pasture rangelands. Hunter-gatherers rely on wild fruits and tubers and honey from the forest. So really, they are in the first line, they are people who are affected immediately by negative impact of climate change. But beyond the negative impact of climate change, Indigenous people also, because they are relying on this system over time, have developed coping and adaptation mechanisms through their Indigenous knowledge practice systems that can also maybe provide solutions, part of the solutions for climate change.
Could you give me an example of how they've adapted?
Maybe just before I give you how they have adapted is one of the impacts, for example, the last 3 years, the drought in Kenya has wiped almost 80% of livestock among pastoralist Maasai in Kenya. Water is a big issue, for example. For hunter-gatherers, if there are no wild fruits in the forest and the honey is down because there are no flowers because of the extreme dry situations as an impact of climate change, their basic livelihoods are so directly affected that when we see the negotiation going slowly like this, we wonder, they cannot wait for a slow process like this. Their impact is on a day-to-day basis. But then how they have adapted, for example, for the Maasai, they have mobility. Oftentimes classified as nomadic pastoralism. Because rainfall is scarce in these rangelands, in space and time, meaning pasture and water is also scarce, so it rains sporadically across the rangelands. They have adopted a system of moving with their livestock to where pasture is, to where water is. And therefore, they need an open space to be able, for example, to do this. Beyond that, they have also traditional institutions. They have belief system, for example, around the environment. Like, for example, you cannot cut a tree across among the Maasai community because it's equal to murder, and there are taboos around that. The institution, for example, of Oloiboni in one of the forests, which we did a case study in southern Kenya, this is a person who is perceived to be the spiritual guardian of the forest because of the spiritual connection between the people and the forest and forest resources, where traditional cultural practices are practiced. Women fertility ceremonies are practiced here. Age-set leaders, initiation of age-set leaders, hardly any rite of passage or social-cultural practices is practiced without a plant of some sort. Indigenous medicine, for example, they have also adapted over time to know how to use aspects of plants, whether leaves, barks, or roots, to be able to use them as medicine for treating certain ailments. So they have both institutions, and they have both the value system, and they have knowledge developed around this environment that would be useful in the context, for example, of REDD+ and all these adaptation mitigation strategies. So they are not only victims, but they are also part of a solution.
Okay, and so if we bring this to the negotiations, what is it you want to see reflecting Indigenous people within the negotiations?
First of all, I would love to see an overarching human rights-based approach in all interventions. This is taking in cognizance of, the so-called common but differentiated responsibility, recognizing the individual capacities to adapt and to mitigate. Indigenous people are, as I said, are mostly affected. So there has to be a recognition, as much as there is that differentiation within states, across states, it should be also within individual states because of the question of marginalization. So there has to be a human rights approach, not just a human rights approach, but it should be based on the United Nations Declarations for the Rights of Indigenous People. Secondly, whenever there are programs and interventions around indigenous people and communities, the question of free, prior, and informed consent, including effective participation in decision-making around this project, should also be part of it. So as they develop a negotiation text, a human rights, social justice approach should be entrenched, and specifically the free, prior, and informed consent. Thirdly is a question of land rights. Land rights for indigenous people. All over the world, indigenous people's rights to land, where forests, for example, are found or are based, oftentimes either taken over by the state or taken over by majority groups within the states that they find themselves in. So there should be structures to allow for security of land tenure of indigenous people. And thirdly is a question of benefit sharing. If you use a state as a negotiation, as a structure for negotiation as provided by the framework of the UNFCCC, and say, for example, this state does not recognize the special situation of indigenous people within the individual countries, where will the outcomes of the negotiation leave the indigenous people of the world who have contributed least? They are not only first to be affected, they are not part of a solution, but they contribute least to emissions. So then I think, therefore, that there should be a recognition that state may not necessarily, in the context of equity and justice and fairness, provide solutions for indigenous peoples where state don't recognize such indigenous people in the individual state. I also think that even the level of degree and the level of how much should we reach before we reach the tip-off level for temperature rise beyond pre-industrialization, we still think, because of the special situation we find ourselves in especially Africa, where I come from, which is the tropics, that 2 degrees centigrade in itself may spell doom for us. Because if this frequent and more intense and more, longer duration of not just a frequency, but even the overstretching of the droughts and famine, as we saw in Kenya, that ended in January this year, are anything to go by. If they are anything indicative of what is happening around global warming and climate change, then the chance for indigenous people being seriously wiped out are real.